I'm Dan Sonis, and I'm the director of the Language Center at the University of Minnesota. And I would like to welcome you to another event hosted by the Language Collaboratory, a partnership for the advancement of intercollegiate dialogue on the teaching of languages and culture. Driven by language centers and institutes at the University of Iowa, the University of Michigan, University of Minnesota, Michigan State University, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Our aim is to provide collaborative professional development opportunities for instructors of language, culture, and literature at the 5 institutions. Our series this fall addresses perennial issues of accessibility, inclusivity, and learner autonomy and agency through the lens of our current shared circumstances, and approaches these issues from a variety of perspectives, building on the expertise of individuals on our own campuses. We aim to share insights and to encourage interinstitutional dialogue, bridging the institutional distance and fostering a collaborative interchange of ideas. You are invited to contribute to what we hope will be a lively discussion. The sessions will be recorded and made available through each institution's website. We ask that you mute your microphone at the outset and that you use the tools in Zoom to contribute questions and comments in the chat. And during the open discussion, to raise your hand virtually prior to activating your microphone. Closed captioning is available through the live transcript button in the Zoom menu bar. Before we start today's session, just a reminder that the next event will be held 2 weeks from today at this time, hosted by the Center for Language Teaching Advancement at Michigan State University on the topic of agency-based language learning. Today's topic comes to us from the Language Center at the University of Minnesota and will be led by Adolfo Carrillo Cabello, the Professional Development Specialist in the center. Adolfo, over to you.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you everyone for joining us. We are hoping to explore more in depth the topic of learner autonomy and learner agency. And we have 3 great instructors at our institution who will be telling us about some projects that they have been working on over the past year. And we are hoping that this will excite you in exploring this conversation. We have 2 guiding questions that we have prepared in advance and share with our discussants today. So I'll be repeating these questions, and then I'll be asking each of them to tell us their thoughts on the 2 questions, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. We also have some questions that were submitted ahead of time, so we'll be touching on this as well. And then, yeah, I was going to ask you to stop sharing. We are first gonna have Brian Barnett, who is the director of the French program at the University of Minnesota, tell us his response to the 2 questions. Again, the guiding questions are, how can you foster student engagement and autonomy in your course? And what does learner autonomy mean in the context of your course? And so I'll pass it on to Brian, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to share your screen, Brian. And you're muted, I believe.
Okay, is that showing up just fine? Okay, thank you, Adolfo. And to begin, I just want to thank my team of coordinators. I know Lauren is here since the work that I'll be talking about was produced in collaboration. And we've been working on a curriculum review of our lower division courses. And one of our outcome is specifically related to the topic of today's presentation on learner autonomy. And here it is. So our courses enable students to develop a language learning strategy repertoire to become a more independent, reflective learner. And this outcome relates back to the first question from today on how to foster student engagement and autonomy. This can be completed with a focus on indirect learning strategies. And these are language learning strategies that support and manage language learning without directly involving the target language. The indirect strategies include metacognitive strategies, such as centering your learning. An example of this would be delaying your speech production to focus on listening, arranging and planning your learning, for example, goal setting, and finally, evaluating. An example of this would be a self-evaluation. Reflection has been referred to as the fourth mode of communication following interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational, and I can see why this is the case. Self-reflection and focus on metacognitive strategies can result in high-impact learning. This can lead to significant personal transformations since learners are asked to take a step back and reflect on learning as a process. On the next slide, I'm going to share a few examples of what supporting learner autonomy can look like. And here are 3 tasks that required students to reflect on their learning experience and use metacognitive strategies, since all 3 were designed to give students a sense of control over their learning. The first one, assessment and self-reflection. So this was completed by students once they've received their results on an assessment. And here are some types of questions that students were asked to answer. So categories of errors, possible reasons for these errors. Students explain adjustment for the next assessment. So once again, monitoring and making plans. And then they were also asked as an optional question, if how other classmates or instructors could help them better prepare for the next assessment. These are just 3 out of about 5 or 6 types of questions. The second task was a participation self-reflection, and this came up during 3 points during the semester, the first during week 2, the second at midterm, and one at the end of the semester. And you can see the categories that students were asked to do a self-assessment on. Prepared for each class meeting, engagement in small group work, engaged in full class discussion, used French, and finally participated in other ways. And some examples of participating in other ways could be attending office hours, doing study groups, listening to French media outside of class, or additional study activities through the course management system. Once they've done the self-assessment, then they are also asked to set measurable, attainable goals and to develop action plans to meet these goals. And finally, there's a mid-semester discussion, keep it, change it. And so students are put in groups, and certain students take on the role of either a timekeeper, spokespeople, or note takers. And they are asked to reflect on questions around the course, so aspects of the course that they would like to keep and aspects of the course that they would like to change. This is an example of one of the questions of aspects of the course that they are hoping to keep. And they also reflect on what they as a learner are able to do in terms of keep it and change it. So there are 4 questions, 2 on the course itself and 2 on the learner experience. So that's a brief summary of some ideas that hopefully are creating learner autonomy. And later on, I'll gladly answer any questions that you may have about these tasks. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Again, we're gonna open it up for questions after we have an opportunity to hear our 3 discussants. So please type your questions in the chat so that we have some ideas for conversation later on. I'm next gonna pass it on to Emily Groepper.
Thanks, Adolfo. So I really started thinking about student engagement and autonomy back when we were working on that PACE project. That was the 4th year of the PACE project, which some of you might be familiar with. But for that project, we were developing course level and curriculum level interventions to promote the development of speaking skills to try and reach that advanced level. And so the professor and I, we were working on a class together, and the question for us was really more about how do we get students to engage more fully with the text that we're using and allow them more opportunities to speak, because it just didn't seem like we had enough class time. So our solution was to have them work with each other outside of class. And of course, in an outside of class type of scenario, the students don't have the same supervision as they might otherwise. And so this led to the development of what I call collaborative dialogues. Collaborative dialogues are, in this case, they were 15-minute conversations between students outside of class. They recorded these conversations and then uploaded them so that the professor and I could review them. We would provide them prompts, and at times we provided Redemittel or sentence starters, sort of speaking help and scaffolding, so that they had some guidance and they could fall back on some structures that they were familiar with and things that we had practiced in class if they really needed help to get the conversation started. But we gave them a lot of freedom in these prompts. So the prompts and the questions that we used were really more to guide the conversation and help them engage with the text, but we didn't require that they answer all the questions or even stick to those topics. If they had something that they found more interesting in the text, or if there was something more pressing that they wanted to discuss, we encouraged that. And the students weren't graded on their completeness of answers or correctness of answers or anything like that. So there was a lot of freedom. And we found that this was really an amazing experiment. By giving students the opportunity to practice language independently and autonomously outside of class. And what I mean by autonomously is that they had control over where the conversation was going. They weren't restricted by our rules and guidelines. So they were able to really dig into the ideas that they were interested in and that they wanted to talk about. And so when it turned around and when we came to class, they were actually more engaged in the activities and more engaged in the content of the class, because they had already practiced some of the things that they would wanted to say, and they were really invested in carrying the conversation further. So after working with this project, this was of course an upper level literature course. And my coordinator is here, she can attest to this. I've been sort of pushy about trying to get these collaborative dialogues integrated into our lower level language courses, because I think they're just fantastic. And I'm often reminded that this takes a lot of time when you have large language classes and they're in partners and they might be talking for 5 to 10 minutes. And if you do this weekly, that's just hours of listening that the instructor has to do. So we have been able to implement these somewhat in smaller increments across a number of our different languages and language levels. So I believe Finnish is actually doing these dialogues in the first semester of Finnish and the third semester. We are using variations of them in the third and fourth semester in German. And I believe there was interest in Dutch, but I'm not sure if it actually happened. But thanks in part to the pandemic, we of course have this new Zoom world that we are able to get students connected to each other in different ways than they might have been able to do it otherwise. And they were just, when this pandemic happened and we moved to online in March, the students just really dug into this activity as a way to mandatorily stay in touch with their friends from class, but also have that extra time outside of class to continue practicing their German. They like to do their language work, right? They enjoy talking to each other and actually using the things that they're learning. And so they were able to, we provided, again, lots and lots of scaffolding is necessary for these lower levels as well. But we provided the scaffolding and the ideas for conversation starters, and then just let them go. And it was just amazing where the conversations went, how much they talked with each other. It was just a really fantastic experience. And we have, in the course I'm teaching currently, which is our 5th semester class, we are doing these collaborative dialogues also. And it's been fantastic, because the day after that conversation, they come and they are so excited to talk more about the material that they have already engaged with. And just this independence and the engagement levels have been really a lot higher.
Thank you, Emily. And next we're gonna have Katrien Vanpee to talk to us about the Arabic program.
I'm just going to share my screen with some slides. Here we go. There we are. There we go. Okay. For me, an autonomous learner is a learner who is capable of articulating goals and needs, of planning what to do and when, of selecting materials to engage with, of executing their plans, and of assessing how things went. To learn autonomously, a student needs, among other things, motivation, an active and proactive approach, metacognitive awareness, this is what Brian was talking about, and insight more specifically into learning strategies. This means that anytime we as educators do something in our classroom to work on any of these elements, we are also working on fostering learner autonomy. And that applies to very small as well as larger interventions, I think. The example that I would like to highlight today is a project that I'm currently doing with 27 Arabic learners at the beginner and the advanced levels. The core of the project is students' weekly exploration on their own of an activity of their interest, chosen from an elaborate list of options that I provide. Students also complete a weekly report form in which they address a small number of reflection questions. They share their tips and recommendations with each other in a Canvas discussion forum. We have a mid-semester class discussion, both on how the project is going for them and on learning strategies. And they also complete a questionnaire at the start and the end of the semester. I'd like to show very quickly what the list of resources and activities looks like. This is the list for the advanced level. So you see they have the opportunity to explore musicians. The red here is me adding options in the middle of the semester. They explore various music streaming services that they hadn't perhaps known of yet. They can watch TED Talks, satirical TV episodes on YouTube, short films, documentaries, other films. They can take virtual tours of museums on Google Arts and Culture. They can read a short story, read a poem, read the cultural pages of an e-zine dedicated to Arab arts. The list goes on, okay? So as you can see, it's a long list. And it deliberately tries to cater to students' diverse interests to enable every student to find things in there that they're genuinely excited about. Students decide not only which activity or resource they'll explore, but also for how long and when they'll do so based on their personal schedule, as long as the work is in every week by Sunday at 8. This is a project that it gives students elements of choice, and that creates space for their personal interests, which one would hope helps boost their motivation. It includes a weekly reflective component, explicit strategy instruction, and it targets the formation of habits of out-of-class engagement with Arabic. And as such, it really takes a multi-pronged approach to the fostering of autonomous learning. Now, this is, of course, a project with a number of components, but as I suggested, and as Brian and Emily have also already shown, there are many other ways we can go about fostering autonomy in our language courses. And here are some additional ideas. And these other options range from language partnerships, setting your students up with a partner outside of the university. I've worked before with an organization called Netakellem and another Talk Abroad. Now for these, you need some monies, but of course, Emily's idea of the collaborative dialogues does not cost any money at all, which I think is great. Again, if you do specific activities that target self-awareness and motivation, you are also indirectly working on the fostering of autonomy. So that could include adding reflection components to homework assignments, having students keep reflective learning journals in which you don't only ask them to reflect, but also to articulate what they do well. Many of our good students overlook that kind of thing and tend to focus only on what they struggle with, right? Having students write out advice to lower level learners about how to do well in a language class like this, and so on. Additional ideas include work that targets specifically student initiative and choice. Having students lead test review by making each of them responsible for an item of their choice and having them present that item to the class. Having students write test questions for each other as an exercise. Giving students options for their semester-long project. For example, in spring, students could choose in my advanced Arabic class between either doing a reflective learning journal or participating in a translation of an educational video that Anoka County had provided us with, and then the students' translated video went on to YouTube in the service of the community. Finally, also work on time management indirectly works on student autonomy, right? So you could simply, as an assignment, have students draft a study schedule for the week and then reflect with them on what are some good ways of planning in your Arabic study. Does it have to be a block of 3 hours, or is maybe 3 times 30 minutes more useful? So there's all these partial interventions, I think, that are at our fingertips that in themselves also foster learner autonomy. I'll stop here, Adolfo.
Thank you, Katrien. And I'm going to open the floor to welcome questions, reactions, comments. You're free to use, this is the autonomy that you have in this session. If you click on the participants menu at the bottom of your menu bar, it will open the participants panel and you'll be able to see the raise and lower hand option. So take some autonomy to do that and ask your questions live. I haven't seen much coming in the chat, but while we wait for questions or for people who want to ask their questions live, we do have 2 questions, and I'm going to start with Emily on this one since you already kind of touched a little bit on this. And the question we received is, how soon do you start with these promoting learning autonomy? And you briefly touch on the idea of being an advocate for these to be part of the lower level curriculum. Can you expand on this idea as to why lower level might be a good venue to get a head start?
Right, and actually Katrien mentioned this as well. I am a huge proponent of starting from the very, very beginning, especially because students take our courses not just to fulfill their language requirements, but because they're interested in it. And if you can grasp onto whatever they're interested in and really give them the support to be creative and learn more on their own, they're going to create so much more language. I mean, that's what language is. It's about creating meaning. And it's not just these rote structured sentences that are grammatically correct that we want them to repeat. We want to give them the tools to be able to do what they want with the language, right? We do what we want with English all the time. For those of us who are English speakers, we do it all the time in our target languages as well. And I mean, the key is scaffolding for whatever project we're doing. That's the answer for everything. But starting from the very beginning, giving them the tools and the guidance so that when they struggle, they know where they can turn back to and get that help provided by the teacher or other students as well.
Great, excellent. Anything to add, Katrien or Brian?
I think I completely agree with Emily that the lower levels are 100% suited for work on autonomous learning. And that includes strategy instruction, for example, because our students might come into our classes with enthusiasm to learn this language, but we all know they don't necessarily know how to tackle a vocab list in a really efficient manner. Or students in the beginner level and also still at the advanced level will say, well, this listening exercise gave me a hard time and I don't really know how to go about it other than listening twice and being frustrated about it, you know? So having discussions, even just pausing class in the middle of class when you're going over a listening exercise with them and saying, here's a tip for how you could go about this at home. And that strategy, I think, is very useful at all levels. And that includes, of course, not only instruction about cognitive strategies, but also about affective strategies. So how do we help students deal with ideas that they might have in their heads that are really not very useful? For example, everybody else is so much better than me in this class, so I shouldn't speak because everybody else says better. Or I'm just no good at grammar. These fixed mindset ideas, bringing these up in class and showing that, you know, rerouting these ideas to a different orientation can actually help them toward greater success. I think you can totally do that in a beginner level class.
I think just to add to that, I think that even at, we have objectives in terms of language objectives or cultural objectives. I think strategic objectives are another option that you can do at all levels of instruction to incorporate strategies-based instruction into your course. So we often think about what we're trying to do on our outcomes, and I think it's just incorporating the strategic component with everything else that we're doing.
I'm gonna switch gears and go to the second question, and you all have contributed to some ideas to this second question, but just to articulate it more generally. And it may be a hard sell for some programs to give this autonomy and pass it on to students. Like one of the ideas that Katrien had was the students write the questions for our exams, and that may be like a hard sell for some programs. But just in general, with some of the experience that you have had with these, how do you strike a balance between having autonomy and still leading the pedagogical aspects of instruction? And I think, Brian, I'm going to start with you because you have ideas on self-reflection and incorporated in many different aspects at the course level, but also unit level. Can you talk more about striking that balance?
Yeah, I just don't, I see the strategic component or the metacognitive component just as often can just be added on to something that you're already doing. I don't see it having to be a completely separate component of the curriculum. So I think, you know, we've been talking about, well, not today, but I think a lot of us are reflecting on the ideas of DEI and social justice, and those as well aren't just add-ons. It's like something that you're already doing. And I think finding that balance is quite easy because it usually doesn't exist on its own. It can by its own type of reflection. So some of the tasks are on their own, but some of them are merged at the end of an assignment. There's a reflective component to something they're already doing. So I think that's a way to have a balance, is adding it on to what you're already doing, or you can have a separate assignment on its own.
Katrien, Emily, anything to add?
So I was trying to be a teacher with the very stereotypical, like, anticipatory set, direct instruction, guided practice, independent practice. And I think a lot of these components are really important. I think it's much more flexible than that, and having to be able to use that. And this kind of goes to the question that was in chat too, using these independent activities and what students struggle with or what they excel on, or what they excel at, to then inform what we need to go back and work on again, to give them that guidance to keep them going and stepping further, and improving their language skills. So that's a different answer than Brian gave, but I think it's sort of this amorphous process where we're just moving back and forth between these structures that we need to be able to communicate, to using those structures to be more creative with the language itself too.
Katrien, do you have any closing thoughts?
I was actually somewhat distracted by a question in the chat that I was trying to write an answer to that I'm now midway through.
What about grading?
Okay, so for the grading of this particular project that I'm doing, I use a rubric. And so this project of independent exploration does not here my goal is not have students learn the X new words, not at all, right? Rather, the goal is, are students demonstrating that they're forming good habits of independent engagement with Arabic outside of class? And so the weekly report forms that they complete get to that. There's a question in there that inquires whether they have repeated any activity on their own time, in addition to the assignment for the week. And lo and behold, indeed, every single advanced learner in the class has started repeating activities from the list on their own time without having to do so. And so that provides me with useful information that helps me then apply the criteria of the rubric, like how deep is the reflection, how much are students doing on their own, and so on.
And that's a good closing thought, just taking it back with a learning cycle and learning circle, how this all fits into that aspect. And I think we're out of time. I'll pass it on to Dan to close us.
Thank you, Adolfo, and thank you, Brian, Emily, and Katrien. These are really very great ideas that you have. One thing that strikes me is that in order to encourage autonomy, is kind of a paradoxical notion. You need to guide them to it. You need to provide the way that they become independent. But that's kind of the way it goes, and it's really helpful to have great ideas about how to do that. Thank you all for joining us today. I want to remind you that you'll be receiving an email asking for feedback on this session and on the sessions as a whole. We're taking a break next week for Thanksgiving. I want to wish you all a safe and healthy holiday, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Thank you, Adolfo, for guiding this discussion, and thank you all for being with us today.